All right, Chapter 3. Southern Sudan, 2008. The smudge on the horizon gained color as Naya drew nearer, changing from hazy gray to olive green. The dirt under her feet turned to mud and then sludge, until at last she was ankle-deep in water. There was always so much life around the pond. Other people, mostly women and girls, who had come to fill their own containers. Many kinds of birds all flap and twitter and caw, herds of cattle that had been brought to the good grazing by the young boys who looked after them. Naya took the hollowed gourd that was tied to the handle of the plastic container. She untied it, scooped up the brown muddy water, and drank. It took 2 gourdful until she felt a little cooler inside. Naya filled the container all the way up to the top. Then she tied the gourd back in place and took the padded cloth donut from her pocket. The donut went on her head first, followed by the heavy container of water, which she would hold on place with one hand. When the water bounced on her head and her foot sore from the thorn, Naya knew that going home would take longer than coming. But she might reach home by noon if all went well. Southern Sudan, 1985. The tears were hot in Selva's eyes. Where had everyone gone, and why had they left without waking him? He knew the answer, because he was a child, who might tire easily and slow them down and complain about being hungry and cause trouble. I would not have been any trouble. I would not have complained. What will I do now? Selva took a few steps to see what he could. On the far horizon, the sky was hazy from the smoke of the bombs. About 100 paces in front of him, he could see a small pond. Between the pond and the barn was a house, and, yes, a woman sitting in the sun. Holding his breath, he crept closer until he could see her face clearly. The ritual scar patterns on her forehead were familiar. They were Dinka patterns, which meant she was from the tribe that was same as Selva. Selva let out a breath in relief. He was glad that he was not Nur. The Nur and the Dinka had a long history of trouble. No one, it seemed, was sure where Nur land ended and Dinka land started, so each tribe tried to lay claim on the richest areas in water. Over the years, there had been many battles, large and small, between the Dinka people and the Nur. Many people on both sides had been killed, and this was not the same as the war that was going on now between the rebels and the government. The Dinka and the Nur had been fighting each other for hundreds of years. The women looked up and saw him. Selva flinched at her glance. Would she be friendly to a stranger? Would she be angry with him for spending the night in her barn? But at least he was not alone, and that knowledge was stronger than the uncertainty about the woman, what might say or do to him. He walked over toward her. "Good morning, Auntie," he said, his voice trembling. She nodded. She was old, much older than Selva's mother. He kept quiet, waiting for her to speak. "You must be hungry," she said. She stood and went in the house, and a few moments later she came back and gave him 2 handfuls of peanuts, then sat down again. "Thank you, Auntie." Squatting on his haunches next to her, Selva shelled the nuts and ate them. He chewed every nut into paste before he swallowed, trying to make each nut last as long as he could. The woman sat without speaking until he was finished. Then she said, "Where are your people?" Selva opened his mouth to speak, but eyes filled with tears, and he could not answer. She frowned. "Are you an orphan?" He shook his head quickly, and for a moment he felt almost angry. He was not an orphan. He had a father and a mother. He had a family. "I was at school, and I ran away from the fighting. I don't know where my family is." She nodded. "A bad thing, this war. Where are you going to do now, and how will you find them?" Selva had no answer. He had hoped that the woman might have some answers for him. After all, she was an adult. Instead, she only had questions. Selva stayed in the woman's barn again that night. He began to make a plan. "Maybe I can stay here until the fighting stops. Then I will go back to my village and find my family." He worked hard so she would not send him away. For 3 days he fetched firewood from the bush and water from the pond, but for the pond was drying up, and each day was harder to fill the gourds. During the daytime, Selva could hear the distant booming of artillery from the fighting a few miles away. With every shell that exploded, he would think of his family, hoping they were safe, wondering desperately when he would be with them again. On the 4th day, the old woman told him that she was leaving. "You see, the pond is only a puddle now. Winter is coming, and the dry season, and this fighting." She nodded in her head in the direction of the noise. "I will go to a different village near water. You cannot stay with me any longer." Selva stared at her in panic. "Why can't I go with her?" The woman spoke again before he could ask. "The soldiers will leave me alone, an old woman on her own. It would be more dangerous for you to travel with me." She shook her head in sympathy. "I am sorry I cannot help you any more. Wherever it is you walk, you just make sure to be away from the fighting." Selva stumbled back to the barn. "What will I do? Where will I go?" The words repeated themselves 1,000 times in his head. It was so strange. He had known the old woman for only a few days, but now could not imagine what he would do when she was gone. He sat inside the barn and stared out, looking at nothing, as the light grew dimmer and the noises of the evening began, the buzz of the insects and rustling of dry leaves, and another sound. Voices? Selva turned his head toward the sound, and yes, it was voices. Some people were walking towards the house, a small group, fewer than a dozen. As they approached, Selva took a sharp breath. In the fading light, he could see the faces of those nearest to him. Two of the men had patterns of V-shaped scars on their foreheads, Dinka patterns again, the kind that were given to the boys in Selva's village as part of a ritual of becoming a man. Those people were Dinka too. Could his family be among them?